Welcome back. Today we'll get to see multiple stages of the hobby barn as we watch the floor come together. Plus, there's one major change I'll highlight later in the video. Curious if any of you were able to spot it along the way. We'll start as the main framing is nearly wrapped up prior to my post-fix. There were delays throughout this build, primarily while waiting on material orders to arrive. But since I was trying to accomplish this build during a small gap as I transitioned to a new primary day job, I didn't want to waste any available time and filled those waiting periods with excavation and other tasks around the property. I mentioned in an earlier video that we wanted to make sure the building was elevated from the otherwise flat property and ensure adequate drainage. As a result, we knew we had to get some fill brought in and bring up the build site, so I ordered a load of dirt and a load of gravel, just enough material to get the floor and the immediate perimeter up to the target grade. Using the loader bucket, I spread and roughly leveled the fill, stopping occasionally as the local wildlife got a little too involved in watching me build, which highlights one of the better things about where our property is located. The breadth of wildlife we get to be among is a wonderful change from our normal city-dwelling weekday lives. Getting back to work, the tractor made it a relatively quick task to spread the pile of fill. The near side of this shot sits roughly 5 inches higher than the far side, so I'm also spreading some fill on the outside perimeter to continue leveling the eventual floor. Without that, the large additions in the far corner would just fall out the other side anyway. After getting the fill spread broadly, I had to switch to a more manual leveling, both because there is always some manual labor when using machines, but also because I'm not sure the front loader is the right tool for a final leveling step. I set up the transit laser and tried to get the floor within a plus or minus 1 inch across the whole interior, and then raked it smooth and mostly flat. After that, it was spreading a layer of gravel 2 to 3 inches thick. This serves two purposes for us. First, the gravel acts as a capillary break, so even though we are elevated, any moisture in the ground that might try to migrate upwards will hit the air gaps of the gravel and have nowhere further to go. A big advantage since we are planning to have a radiant concrete slab heat the barn. Second, gravel on top of the dirt compacts reasonably well. Not as tightly as some other options, but this goes back to point 1 on drainage, and still leaves us with a nice solid base to put our floor on. With the gravel down, compaction is next. Alila took on the task of handling the plate compactor. This is a machine that does two things. One, it's heavy and shakes, which is great for compacting granular soils. And second, it moves itself forward, until you either run out of gas or kill the engine. So if you choose to use one of these for a project, you've been warned. After a few minutes, we catch Alila demanding to be on camera before she realized that this time I remembered to record. It's much easier to remember when you have a shot that includes both the best thing in your life and the building she's given you permission to construct. I will note here that we are doing these clips across a variety of days and weeks, and we're getting towards the end of the leaves dropping season. This particular day was late in September, and thus the jacket. When compacting, especially on camera, it can be difficult to see what the benefit is. But as Alila makes passes here, the gravel is vibrating and being pressed into tighter fits, and you can see a line start to form between compacted and loose gravel. And you'll have to take my word for it, but the feel when walking on the different levels of compaction is also very noticeable. When loose, it feels like walking on sand, and when compacted, it almost feels like a concrete sidewalk, which I guess is the entire point here. After making a few passes in each direction, compaction was done for now. I then realized I needed more fill to finish around the building and create an apron for the garage. But since the delivery charge on the fill costs almost as much as the fill itself, and we have a machine designed to acquire this fill, and we have 10 acres from which we can source these native materials, I spent a day doing just that, and once again my inner 12-year-old was immeasurably happy. After making a pile of around 30 cubic yards, I once again relied on the loader bucket to relocate it, and then mixed in some manual labor to spread and smooth everything. This took quite a bit more time than I had anticipated, but now it won't be as much of a step up into the barn once the floor goes in. Speaking of the floor, let's take a look at that a bit more closely. I already mentioned that we're going to heat the barn through the slab, so first we have to install a means to retain the heat as well as add the heat. For us, this means about 1,200 feet of half-inch PEX tubing after installing, off-camera, a layer of rigid foam insulation to prevent losing all the heat to the surrounding soils. We were fortunate to have our third set of hands again, which meant we could split the tasks of unrolling the tube, straightening the tube, and installing the retaining clips for the tube. The floor will be 4 loops about 300 feet long each to evenly distribute the heat. Long gone are the days of trying to embed metal pipes in concrete. Those will, invariably, fail. But flexible plastic tube can shift as the floor does and expand and contract a bit before failure, which leads to a much more robust installation. I chose to use a tubing that also has an aluminum wall impregnated into the plastic, which helps with heat conduction as well as durability. After the tubing is in place, it's time for a rebar grid to reinforce the concrete. There is plenty of debate about which rebar to use versus wire mesh perhaps, and the tubes being above or below. The science shows that yes, my method is not as good, but with a difference of only around 1 to 2% in total efficiency, this method gives me a safety margin when I go back to cut the relief joints in the concrete. I only get one chance to do the tubes correctly, so I'll take an efficiency penalty over a non-functioning system. With all of that in place, it's time for the hard part. And I suppose there's a thinly veiled concrete pun in there, but for this particular task I decided to hire out some help. The concrete plants around here don't deliver on the weekends, and asking friends to take PTO for my side project isn't easy either. Aside from that, this crew accepted my offer to just place the mud, float it flat, and then bounce out of there and let me do all of the finishing work. I saved a whole bunch of money, but still got to be heavily involved. Pour day turned out to be miserable weather. High temperatures were around 42 degrees, and we did not add any accelerants for setting the concrete any quicker. This was great for me, as I wasn't up for the summer-like rush of having to get everything done before the concrete is too hard to work. But with that said, I wasn't really prepared for the nearly 5-hour wait for the bleed water on the concrete to evaporate enough to get started. After the pour was done, one of my first checks on the readiness of the concrete to do the finishing was to add in the extra slope for the exterior garage apron. The idea being to give any water against the door a running start downhill and away from causing problems, particularly in the winter where the weather seal might freeze to the ground. I recognized pretty quickly that I still had a long time to wait before troweling the concrete, so I went and got some dinner, did some shopping for a new hoodie that was a bit more dry as the rains of the day had already soaked through the first one. After dinner and after dark, I got started with the power trowel. The first pass learning to use the machine was pretty rough. There is a method to controlling these that I was not really aware of at first. Luckily, the concrete still wasn't quite ready for this step anyway, so I took another break and read up on how to control the machine, and when I came back after another hour, the process was much easier. Instead of fighting the machine, I was able to have it go where I needed it to. The original goal in renting the power trowel was to create a super smooth and burnished surface. However, I decided just a few days before this that I will eventually do an epoxy floor coating, particularly because it will hide any imperfections in the floor from my novice status as a finisher. And it's good I decided that, as the results turned out only marginally better than my apprentice level standing. Still, I'm very happy with the way these couple of days went and with the results of the floor. The last bit of video here is the outside porch concrete. I need to have the concrete in place to support the posts and the porch roof loads, but it wasn't a large enough area to order any ready mix, so I'm using a bag mix and some good old-fashioned labor. While not as easy as letting a truck do a lot of the work, the surcharge for such a small amount of concrete means this is the better balance of cost and results. Now, we've gotten to this point in the video, and I've yet to circle back on the big change I mentioned in the intro. So let's pause for just a moment to see if you've figured it out yet. It turns out, when your wife starts feeding you green food and you spend a few weeks building a barn, there are some positive health changes involved. So there it is, the penultimate episode of the main build. Just a few more tasks to wrap up the exterior, and then we'll get to work on the inside for the winter. In the next episode, you can follow along as Alila and I try our hand at installing our semi-custom garage door. Neither of us have ever done it before, but the result of the final visual piece exceeds our expectations on the look of the barn.